So this is the story, okay, in a nutshell. But let's look at the land use, because I think that's very important. And I base some of my, what I'm going to say on what Jim Brady said when he wrote regarding the St. Paul Half-Breed Reserve. And he said, opponents stated that the reserve had been terminated because the Métis failed to become self-supporting. But when we look at evidences, it doesn't really look that way. First of all, I'm always shocked when I read about St. Paul by the fact that we have the impression that there were no Métis families that were living in that area before even the reserve was open, which is not true, of course. There were like a lot of Métis free traders that were living in the region way before St. Paul was created, and the Desjardins and the Cardinal were living in that area. And also, it's a region that is renowned for its good fishing, for its good hunting, and for its trapping. And actually, Father Lacombe, when he writes about St. Paul, the St. Paul area, he talks about an oasis. Also, according to Brady and Adrian Hope, St. Paul got its name from St. Paul Cardinal, who in 1884 erected a cabin. It was known as St. Paul's Place among early Métis in the region. And also, when we look at the correspondence of Father Lacombe, he does mention, when he's still writing to his bishop, he does mention that actually there were already a number of families that were living in that area, and that these families were planning on staying there and continuing on living in the area. Also, what we find when we look at evidences, and I will connect with what Alice said earlier about the corridors, what we're seeing is that St. Paul de Métis people were actually traveling back and forth to Wolf Lake, which was for a while a wintering camp, for hunting and trapping, but also for whitefish. And when we look at the correspondence of Father Terrien, he does talk about the fact that he's encouraging the Métis people to go to Wolf Lake, to Lac du Loup, Wolf Lake, in order to go fishing on fishing expeditions. And he does that regularly with people, so then people can prepare food for the winter. Also, in his report, Routin, who was agent of the Dominion's land in Edmonton, a report that he wrote in 1899, he says that there's a lot of pike, abundance of pike in the area, that there's a lot of timbered land for construction and fencing, that the soil, and I underlined, of excellent quality, and that's important because that's what will attract, to open St. Paul for general settlement, and that the Métis had under cultivation 363 acres, and that they were cultivating wheat, barley, oats, and they also had gardens, like vegetable and potato gardens. We also know that there were some pigs, and that Terrien brought the pigs and then exchanged that with the inhabitants in order to get free labor. And that they had plows and harrows and disc and binder and mower, and that they were building in 1899, they were actually 1898 when the agent came, they were building a grist mill in order to be more self-sufficient. But he does say that farm implements are missing to cultivate more, and that in the next years it will be important for the colony to have more farm implements. Also, if we look at some of the oral history, according to Joe Collins, who came from Montana, the land was rich, plenty of ducks, the water unspoiled. Trees were cut to make log houses. It was hard work since there were no saws. First, we live in tents, 7 families. It took us 1 week to set up log houses, barns, and fences. We know also that there were freighting activities that were happening between Vegreville and Edmonton, and that some of the families, the Métis families that were living in the area, were also working for surveyors like Marshall Hopkins, and they would receive a salary of $50, $40, or $35 depending on their skills. There is also Adrian Hope, who mentions that, how people were working the land and how they were breaking the land and how they were building the houses, and also mentions that these people were also building the church and ended up building the boarding school. So that's a lot of work, and some of it was not recognized, obviously. And he continues and mentions that they ceded 10 acres plots that they had broken. And Brady adds that some of the families had cattle and horses. And when you look at the numbers, I don't know if you can see them, I can't even see them on my, but in some cases people had like 1,300 head of cattle. That's a lot. Well, it seems to me, like I'm not a rancher of any kind, but I mean, And the same with horses, and so some of the families, the Laframboise and the Garneau and the Poitras, had quite a lot of cattle and horses, and some of them had trading posts. A document signed by Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier in 1899 also concludes that the efforts made by the trustee, so the trustee of the Catholic Church, have been successful. So, obviously in 1899, even Wilfrid Laurier thought that the colony was doing okay. But the thing is, things start to change, so when you read the correspondence, when you read some of the documents in the archives, you realize that, people are always trying to find the failings of the Métis, and will bring that out as soon as something is not going well. And in 1904, we know that there was a crop failure, but that's nobody's fault, it just happened. But what will come out very quickly is that as we move forward, and especially starting in 1904 to the opening of the colony to general settlement, what we're seeing is that, there's a lot of things that irregularities, or as Frank mentioned this morning, what we call sharp dealings. So we know from Brady that there were two issues, the railroad, but that's not new, and also the penetration of settlers in contiguous territory. But what is interesting is when you start reading some of the archival documentation, especially the correspondence between, the clergy and the government, what we're seeing is that the squatters were handled in a rather soft manner, which I find really interesting, because when we look at specific areas where Métis squatted, they were not, dealt with in a soft manner. So there's two standards, double standards. So the problem appeared in 1904 when Charles Tremblay had entered and squatted on the boundary of the reserve. And there's other documents, affidavits, that are showing that other people did the same thing. But in Tremblay's case, Norquay was a land agent in Edmonton, writes to the Ministry of Interior to ask if the land can be taken as a homestead. The response was from the Ministry of Interior that it can't satisfy the desire of the squatters, but if the syndicate agrees, the men could stay. The burning of the school also precipitated the idea of transforming the colony, and the person who championed that was Terrien, the Father Terrien, who convinced Frank Oliver, he's everywhere, obviously, we heard that he was in Edmonton earlier, so was at the time Minister of the Interior in 1905, to survey around the colony and open the area for homestead. But also, Terrien actually encouraged people to take homestead outside the colony. And it seems that eventually he used the evidence that the Métis used the evidence of the fact that some of the Métis moved out of the reserve to take homestead outside, and he used that evidence to tell the government that the Métis were no more interested in the colony. So, talk about sharp dealings. On several occasions, Oliver was informed by Métis settlers that people were squatting on land, such as a man named Fouquet, and he had fenced off 2 sections of colony land. So, there was some writing with Oliver, and Oliver said, well, at first, he didn't want to give this guy another 160 acres, but that that nothing would be, they would do nothing. They would not ask Fouquet to leave. So it's like, whatever, he can stay, even though he's squatting on this reserve. Another correspondence so what you have to realize is that by 1805, 1806, it's quite clear that there's rumors that this colony is going to be open to general settlement. And the Métis, of course, heard about those rumors, of course. So they write to the Ministry of the Interior, Oliver, and ask what's going on, let us know. And as was said earlier, as Frank said, and also Jason, people were asking questions and demanded answers. And Oliver said in 1907, no, there's no provision that has been made to open the colony. But then by August 11, 1908, an order in council requests the termination of the Métis leases on the land. But the minister says, okay, we're going to close we're going to open the colony, but before, what we need to do is to make sure that we look at the claims of the Métis people. So they sent a guy named Samuel Maber, and in his report, he notes that 63 families had legitimate claims. And it says 20 heads of families settled on 80 acres and received patent for homestead elsewhere. 28 others had 80 acres but had not exhausted their homestead right, eligible to 160 acres of land, and 15 were holding entries for homestead outside of the reserve. He declared that 19 were not residents and had no right for consideration. And most of these people, the 19 people, were unmarried sons that were living with their fathers or elderly fathers who were living with their son. So that meant that in the end, or even sometimes in some cases, people were away, and the wife was away, and then when they came back, they had no claim anymore for their land. And so ultimately they were denied, even though they had resided in the area, they were denied residence. In April 10th, 1909, the reserve is open to settlement, and then French Canadians people line up in the Dominion Land Office in Edmonton. And what's interesting is that some of these families had been informed by Terrien that there were land available and that each settler was allotted a number which matched the homestead location on a list. And they said Oliver had one of his employees there, and he sent that employee to the land office in Edmonton. So obviously something happened there, that there was some trafficking, that there was some irregularities that were happening. And the fact also that the tactic clearly blocked individuals whose claim had been disallowed from making entries as well. What we know also, at the moment that it's open to the general settlement, is that there's some dealings that are happening where some Métis that were illiterate were being used in order to get their land. And so there's a lot of that going on, but what we know from histories that have been written in the past, some of the documents have disappeared. According to Ken Hatt, who's an historian who wrote like a paper on St. Paul, the government knew that trafficking was happening and needed to be rectified. There was, however, ambiguity on how to treat the Métis land. On the one hand, the land were considered as a special grant, and on the other, homesteading duties were required before patent could be received. And there's ample evidence to know that to see that the government doesn't really know what to do with those lands. So in conclusion, in an interview, Richard Poitras mentions that Frenchmen came in as a flock, not a trickle, but a big flock. The arrival of new settlers brought further difficulties tied to blatant discrimination and racism. Métis families had a hard time to compete with French Canadians' families because most of them couldn't get money from banks, so they had a disadvantage. And it pushed many families away from Saint-Paul-des-Métis towards northern Alberta, towards Lesser Slave Lake and Fishing Lake area. And when we look at the dealings at what happened around Saint-Paul-des-Métis, it's very clear that there was paternalism, patronage, secrecy. We talked a lot about secrecy and earlier this morning, but it's very clear in the case of St. Paul, and trafficking were at the center of Saint-Paul-des-Métis experiment and experience. There is ample evidence that the Métis developed this colony and gave a lot of free labor to the church. It is also quite clear that the land granted to Métis settlers were never clearly defined. As Sawchuk and Ferguson noted, the rationale in opening the colony was that the Métis needed protection from the competitiveness of colonists. Upon the closing of the colony, they needed to be integrated with the European colonists and imbued with their competitive spirit. So it's like being stuck between those two ideas, and it doesn't give much opportunities for people ultimately. And the last result is that most of the families left Saint-Paul-des-Métis. Thank you very much for your attention.